guys, and welcome to this extra episode of the OCDstories.com podcast. Now, this episode is out of the regular Sunday episodes, and I wanted to do it as the second part in the Covid-19 coronavirus series that I originally did with Dr. John Grayson, and this is the second part with Jon Hershfield, where I got John on to talk about moral scrupulosity. Now, this is something John's seen in his practice recently, so we wanted to talk about it in case many of you listening have experienced similar, and hopefully this episode can help you at this time. Now, just generally on the coronavirus, I hope you and your families are safe and are doing okay. My thoughts are with you at this time, and I'm wishing you guys all the best. Thank you as always for listening, and I hope this episode with John helps you. On the podcast today, I have Jon Hershfield. Jon is a psychotherapist who specialises in the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder. He is the author of 5 OCD books, including his most recent book, Overcoming Harm OCD. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Hi, Stuart. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, good to have you back. And today we're obviously going to talk about coronavirus or COVID-19 and OCD, but specifically around moral scrupulosity. So I guess before we get into the meat of it, what is moral scrupulosity?
So moral scrupulosity is a theme that shows up in obsessive compulsive disorder, wherein the trigger or the contaminant is to your moral identity. So it's basically concerns about knowing for certain if you've done the right thing or are doing the right thing or believe in the right thing. So the term scrupulosity is usually in reference to religious scrupulosity, which are obsessions about your faith, whether you believe it enough or if you're having sacrilegious thoughts or things like that. And so if you were to map that on to a more secular concept, the faith in whether or not you're a good person and the rules of society, moral scrupulosity is concerned with that.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. And in terms of both obsessions and compulsions, what do they look like for this theme?
So obsessions being unwanted intrusive thoughts, images, or urges, they tend to be things like, did I do something immoral in the past? Or do I have an immoral belief right now? Or am I having the right or am I having the wrong feelings about something that's happening right now? Would I ever do the wrong thing? Have I been or am I being perfectly honest about something? Am I in any way harming someone in a nonviolent sense or facilitating the harm of someone in some indirect way? And then the compulsions tend to be a lot of mental rituals, so a lot of mental review of the offending concept, a lot of internal reassurance seeking or rationalizing about the morality of the trigger, significant amount of reassurance seeking. So these are clients that you'll see that will ask you a lot about, would you have ever done this? Or do you think that this makes me a good or a bad person? A lot of avoidance of morally ambiguous situations, things where they might have to make moral decisions. They might opt out of those situations sometimes. And then a lot of the other themes that show up in OCD, if you dig deep enough into them, they often tend to have a moral underpinning to them. For example, if you have unwanted intrusive thoughts about your sexual orientation, you might be thinking of it in terms of, it would be immoral for me to continue in this heterosexual relationship if I'm secretly gay. And so the compulsion might be to try to get certainty about your sexual orientation, not because you particularly care about your sexual orientation, but because it would be wrong not to do so. And you would see that in other themes as well. It would be immoral for me to make the personal choice not to wash my hands right now, even though maybe I don't need to wash my hands, but who am I to decide? So I'm going to go wash my hands, and that might be a moral wash. Yeah. And then sometimes there's sort of very indirect rituals that take place that they're purely ritualistic in the sense that it's hard to see how one actually connects to the other, but it still makes you feel better. So I had a bad thought. Maybe I don't, maybe I think it's okay if old people die. And then I feel guilty about having that thought. And so then I'm going to go take a shower and I'm going to start my day over. And now I'm clean and I'm moving forward. And I'm not the same person from before that shower who had that nasty thought. And so that shower is obviously not directly tied to anything in particular, but it's still serving that same function of morally decontaminating your identity.
Yeah, it's kind of like a fresh start or hitting the reset button on
Exactly.
the day. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see that come up in a lot of different ways. I mean, it might include things like counting or tapping or any kind of, I'm going to do this, and then I've hit the reset button, and that's the compulsion. And it can be very subtle, and often the person struggling with it might not even fully understand why they're doing it, but they're conditioned to do it over and over again. It becomes natural to them.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And, you brought this topic up to me as an important one to discuss at this time. Why is that?
So when the pandemic was just beginning, we were seeing lots of articles about, this is going to be bad for people with OCD. They're already washing their hands too much, and they're already worrying about their health too much. And while that's certainly been an issue for some people, by and large, it's not what I'm seeing in my clinical population. More of what I'm seeing are moral concerns about how to deal with the pandemic, not concerns about getting sick or even getting others sick quite so much. Or if it is a concern about getting others sick, it's from the standpoint of, is it moral for me to accept uncertainty in this moment? And that's where I'm seeing a spike in suffering. So CDC guidelines might say something like you should wash your hands for 20 seconds. If you're touching something, outside of the house and you've come in the house, you should wash your hands for 20 seconds. So let's say you wash your hands for 20 seconds, but then you have a thought about whether or not on the way to the sink, your elbow bumped the side of something, their bookshelf. So then you might think, okay, well, that has nothing to do with the CDC, and I don't have to worry about that, and I should leave it alone. And then your moral scrupulosity says, whoa, who are you to make these decisions, right? I mean, it is possible somehow that something got on your elbow and then it got on the bookshelf, and then you're just going to say, I'm following the CDC guidelines and just drop it. Well, that's very aloof of you. And then the guilt starts to set in, and then before you know it, you're disinfecting something that you're not even sure you even touched. So there's that. And then I'm also seeing a lot of moral obsessions around not feeling bad enough. So, ironic or not, since I've started doing full-time teletherapy and working from home, I've been leading a much healthier lifestyle than I was before. I was, waking up always in a rush, get the kids on the school bus, scarf down some breakfast, rush to my center, work, stay late to catch up on my notes, and and then come home, see my kids for a couple of minutes, put them to bed, and scarf down some food. And since I started working from home, I've spent a lot more time with my wife and children. I've been a lot more comfortable with saying, I'll write this progress note later. I'm gonna, go have dinner with my family or something like that. I have an hour break. I'm going to go for a little walk, or maybe I'll get some exercise in, something like that. And it feels good. And I'm very fortunate and very grateful, especially that I work in a profession where I'm able to continue working at all. But I'd be lying if I said my life wasn't on the whole better. Now that's an uncomfortable thing to say. Well, there's thousands of people dying out there. Obviously, I want the pandemic to end as soon as possible. Obviously, I want us all to go back to something like the previous rendition of the world as soon as possible, because that's what's best for humanity. But there's a conflict there, which is internally I'm also feeling pretty good. And if you were to apply a few doses of moral scrupulosity to that, you could get lost in a rabbit hole of how awful a person must I be to recognize any good feelings while people are dying. That dialectic of this is good and also this terrible thing is happening and they're related is very hard to hold in your mind. It's two opposing forces to hold in your mind at the same time. And if you're prone to moral scrupulosity, you're going to end up doing a lot of battling. So one of the more insidious compulsions that comes up with moral scrupulosity is this, what I call kind of dwelling, where you're taking an emotion that's a kind of self-punishment, like guilt, and you're dwelling on it. You're pushing it. You're forcing it to the forefront. If I feel guilty, it means I know that I'm a good person, because a good person would feel guilty about having a bad thought. And so I'm making myself feel guilty. instead of just being mindful of like, oh yeah, that's uncomfortable, I feel a little bit of guilt, but you know what, I'm going to go play with my kids and ignore it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm seeing a lot of people who are suffering with things like that, where they're coming up with reasons to make themselves unhappy because they're uncomfortable with the happiness that they have while we're living through this tragic time.
Yeah, good example. And it kind of, what came to me was, it's very, as OCD often is, very black and white. It looks for that kind of, as in this case, right and wrong, when in reality, we could get philosophical here. What is right and wrong? There's lots of grey, there's nuance to it. And with this specific theme, that nuance isn't justifiable or allowed. It has to be black or white.
Yeah. I'll often ask my clients with moral scrupulosity, when they're debating over whether or not something is good or not good, whether they're good or not good, I'll ask them, well, how good do you have to be? And they can never answer the question, because it implies that there is a spectrum of goodness and badness, and that there is that gray area, because they're operating under the belief that there is this thing called good, and it's this stable thing. And then there's the other things that are not good, and that's a stable thing. And we just have to make sure that we're not good. But in fact, it should have variations and ebb and flow like absolutely everything else on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned hand washing there. How has social distancing came into some of the obsessions?
So I'm hearing a lot of obsessions around things like, obviously, did I wash my hands enough? Did I wash my hands in the right way? And again, not as a scientific question, but as a moral question, right? Can I confidently say with 100% honesty that I know with 100% certainty that I've followed the CDC guidelines perfectly, and that any bad thing that might result at this point forward could never be traced back to me because I did it the right way and the good way and the moral way? And the other way it's manifesting too are things like going out for a walk, let's say, in a non-crowded space, and you pass by another person and you're maintaining that 6-foot distance or however much distance is appropriate. But then, you start measuring it in your head. Was it exactly 6 feet? Or is it possible that I coughed and didn't know it? Is there any way that I could have put some other person at risk? And then kind of reviewing and replaying over and over, kind of watching the tape, the recording in your head of your every move to make sure that you were in no way responsible for doing the wrong thing. And these can be especially difficult in situations where you have to go out. Let's say you have to go to the grocery store to get food, and you're following all the rules, and you're wearing your mask, and you're wearing your gloves, and you're staying 6 feet apart. You're doing everything you're supposed to do. But of course, there's going to be little inconsistencies, and it's just inevitable. I went to the grocery store a couple of weeks ago and had it all. I had the mask, I had the gloves, I was super cool and super depressing, and I absolutely hated every second of it. I mean, I just I'm very resistant to this version of the world. I'm trying to be mindful of it, but it just makes me very unhappy. I come home and I'm just a wreck, Thankfully, I don't have to do it very often, but even while I was there and I'm being careful, well, I had to kind of move one of my gloves a little bit to kind of get my pinky finger out there so I could pull my credit card out of my wallet, or I could press something on my phone, which had the list of things I needed to get. And I think I did okay, but maybe there's some molecule of something that worked its way in there in some way. And even though I think I did a pretty good job coming home and tracing my steps and washing and disinfecting, of course I missed something. I had to have missed something. Am I allowed to let that go? Or am I supposed to feel bad? Or is there something I'm supposed to do, or somebody I'm supposed to ask, or some research I'm supposed to do online? That's another thing I forgot to mention earlier. We were talking about compulsions and moral scrupulosity. Just like with health anxiety or many other obsessions, there's a lot of research that might go on, philosophical research, research into morality, and would a good person do this, and would a bad person do that sort of stuff. So some things to watch out for.
Yeah. I mean, questions no one's ever figured out. So it's an endless compulsion there.
That's right. Yeah, you could take a graduate course in philosophy and think, okay, now that's going to give me the information I need, and then you realize, oh, this is just a bunch of dead people who couldn't figure it out either.
Yeah, true. Okay, so next one is, you may have answered this, I'll ask it anyway, is how do those with moral scrupulosity cope with thoughts about having spread COVID somehow?
Yeah, so I mean, we were kind of touching on this
Yeah.
just earlier, where that let's say the person without moral scrupulosity might feel a little uncomfortable and go, oh, gosh, someone I know got it, and I saw them not too long ago, and that's a disturbing thought. And like any kind of OCD, I think we make a major misstep at the beginning of OCD therapy when we start telling people that they're having OCD thoughts and the thoughts are irrational. It's the response to the thoughts that's not rational. It's the behavior that's out of whack, because the thoughts have nothing to do with you. How could they be irrational? You're not creating them, so you can't give them any kind of real quality. And if you actually look at what people are afraid of in general with OCD, there are things that are perfectly reasonable to not like, right? Who wants to wake up and find that their identity has changed? Who wants to get sick, right? Who wants to be covered in somebody's bodily fluids? It's disgusting. That's totally normal to not like those things. And the reaction that is appropriate for living a life of suffering that's not the most possible suffering is to go, ooh, and then move along. Or, oh, that's uncomfortable. Gee, that's hard for me to deal with. Okay, I'll do the best I can. As opposed to engaging in compulsions to try to be certain. And so the same is true with moral scrupulosity. You might have a thought of, gee, maybe I did the wrong thing. And maybe I hurt someone's feelings, or maybe I got someone sick, or maybe I wasn't entirely honest about something because I was avoiding, being uncomfortable. I don't really like the way that feels. Okay, I'm allowed to be discomforted by that. And then if you don't have moral scrupulosity, you then say like, okay, yeah, maybe I learned something, maybe I didn't. All I know right now is I don't feel very comfortable, and it's time to move on. If you do have moral scrupulosity, you now have this mandate, this responsibility. It's almost like a law. I have to get to the bottom of this. I have to solve this crime, even though I'm not sure there's a crime to solve. And that's where people with moral scrupulosity get into trouble, where it's, okay, the idea that perhaps I somehow spread COVID, maybe I didn't wash my hands properly and I touched something and then someone later touched it and then they put their finger in their eye. Even though, just as a point of fact, there's no evidence that anybody has ever gotten sick that way. We do know that the virus could live on this or that surface for this amount of time, yeah, sure, but there's still no evidence that anybody's actually gotten sick that way. Nonetheless, I don't want to be the test case. I don't want to be, patient zero for that mode of transmission. And I don't like the idea that maybe I spread it. So someone with moral scrupulosity is going to spend a lot of time trying to remember, trying to figure it out. If they can figure it out, they're going to rationalize why it was okay. They're going to say, well, it's very unlikely that I got someone sick because even though I did touch that without washing my hands, I had washed my hands previous, and it's very unlikely that I touched the virus. They'll do math in their head to try to make it feel okay. And if they can't do that, they might go in the other direction and just brutalize themselves. I'm trash. I'm the worst. I'm a piece of garbage. I hate myself. I can't do anything right. I'm a bad person. And there becomes this kind of masochistic delight. Right? We always think compulsions are compulsions because they make you feel better. But the problem is some compulsions make you feel worse by design because they relieve you of the discomfort of having gotten away with anything. And getting away with something is the scariest thing in the world for the morally scrupulous. Living as a fugitive in denial is the scariest thing for the morally scrupulous. So if I can at least make sure that I've served some kind of justice on myself by squeezing my heart and strangling it, well, at least there's that, And of course, I want my clients to not do that. I want them to recognize that, apply self-compassion. Yes, this is hard. And maybe do some exposure to, hey, that's the way of the world, right? Maybe do the little dance with some sociopathy. How sociopathic are you allowed to be? It's got to be something more than zero.
Yeah, I like that. That was interesting as well. About the kind of being a fugitive is the worst thing in this case. I can relate to that too. Okay, so next question is, what impact has COVID had on moral obsessions about the past? in your experience?
So with some people I've spoken to, it's had no impact, and with some it's had a very interesting and positive impact. So moral obsessions about the past, sometimes you'll see it referred to online as real event OCD. And it actually comes in two forms. So one would be real event OCD, where an event happened in your past. It was a negative thing. Upon reflection, you concluded that it was the result of you having made a bad choice. And now, whether that's true or not, I mean, it's entirely possible that you didn't make a bad choice, but somehow you came to that conclusion, and now you can't let it go. And so you think about it all day, you retrace it, you replay it all day, you ask for reassurance about it, you want to let it go desperately, but you refuse to let it go given the opportunity because that feels too flippant. And so there's lots of people out there right now whose narratives are defined by a thing that happened to them at some point in their life. And I'm not talking about traumas or things where they're the victim. I'm talking about situations where they think they may have hurt someone or may have been responsible for someone getting hurt. And so they'll replay it over and over and over again, and they condition themselves to not be able to live a life that's anything but contaminated by that event. And the other kind of moral obsession about the past would be something like false memory obsessions, or this question of, I think I may have done something, or I have no idea, but it's possible I could have done something. A lot of this has gotten stirred up by the cancel culture and the Me Too movement and things like that, where people are wondering if it's possible that they oppressed someone or harmed someone in some way, because they're seeing it reflected back to them that there can be really severe consequences for having done the wrong thing. So how do I know for sure I haven't done the wrong thing? So sometimes it's about an event that actually took place that's being processed in an unhealthy way, and sometimes it's about an event that didn't take place, but you can't be certain that it didn't take place. And in any case, so the pandemic's come along, and it said, this is happening. This is important. This is serious. You need to pay attention to this. And although there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, meaning how many people are going to get sick, how long is it going to last, how do I keep my family safe? I mean, there's plenty of uncertainty-laden questions there. There is also a great certainty that it is there and it is real. And at this point in the game, too, we all know somebody who knows somebody who's gotten sick. And soon we're all going to know somebody who got sick. And that's very unsettling. And when you have that reality put in front of you, while you're also having obsessions about the past, either something that probably didn't occur, but you can't prove it didn't occur, or something that did occur, but you can't prove that you handled it in the way that you've been thinking about it. And then you're forced to compare that to something that's right in front of you that's definitely real. Sometimes it can have this weakening effect on the OCD. It almost supersedes the OCD, where you start saying, you know what, I just can't do this anymore. I can't deal with this anymore. I can't think about that anymore. It's just not important in comparison to this thing that's in front of me that's obviously real and obviously requires my attention. And the pandemic comes as a liberator from your past, which is a very interesting thing to witness. And this is not true for all of my morally scrupulous clients. I'm just saying for some of them, it sort of highlights the absurdity of the amount of effort that they've put into trying to be certain about something that's not possible to be certain about, because it's put something right in front of them that is certain, that's real, and say, can't you see the difference? Right? Yeah. This is part of the beauty of mindfulness, right? When you meditate and you really learn how to meditate and you really learn how to be mindful, what you're really learning is how to recognize the difference between a story and an experience. And it's not that stories are bad and experiences are good. It's just that they're not the same thing. And when we think they're the same thing, we get lost in our stories, our obsessions. When we remember they're not the same thing, we're able to maintain perspective. Yeah. So that's the sort of interesting impact that I've seen in some people, where it's like, you know what, I'm not going to push myself so hard. I'm not going to be so hard on myself about whatever this thing is I did in my past. Okay. But there's some quality to it that's a narrative. And I can see that it's a narrative because there's something real that's happening, and I see that that's different. Of course, for others, it's having the opposite effect, wherein it either there's additional pressure to figure it out, like we might die, or something terrible might happen, and if I don't prove with 100% certainty that I'm a moral human being by the deadline, whatever that is, then that would be really bad. And then there's that secondary obsession that comes up as well, which is I feel guilty about continuing to have this obsession, right? I'm worried about whether I, cheated on a test in the 7th grade. Meanwhile, all these people are dying, and it's further proof of what an awful human being I am that I don't just drop it, right? And so the new moral obsession is an obsession with continuing to have the obsession.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it just shows again how OCD can find any way to twist it, and either in some cases you said give them relief from that real event OCD for the time being, or even just adding to it and making them guilty that they're not focusing on the pandemic. I was going to say, anyone who's interested in mindfulness, as you just mentioned, we obviously did an episode with Charla as well, so I'll link to that in the show notes. And I have in a few weeks a full episode on real event OCD coming out, so check that out.
Great.
Right, plugs done. So we did answer this, but I'll ask it again just in case there's anything else you want to add, which is what's the deal with feeling guilty about doing okay right now, which of course we talked about at the start.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to remember is whatever you're feeling is okay to feel, right? And that is just a fundamental truth. And if you disagree with that, it means you don't understand how feelings work. It means that you're clinging to some idea that you're responsible for your feelings, that you're the author of your feelings and your thoughts, that you're somehow creating them from some place where these things are created that you're in control of, which is just fundamentally untrue. You are responsible for how you incorporate those feelings into your behavioral life and into your interactions with other people. That's where you have some wiggle room. And being honest, you don't have total control over that either, because you're influenced by your conditioning, which comes from your genetics and your lived experience and, of course, your parents. So the idea that I feel guilty for feeling good, okay, well, if you understand how your OCD works, probably it doesn't come as a huge surprise to you that you're feeling that way. If you start from the perspective of, okay, so this is the feeling that's arising and I'm seeing it. Not my favorite, but there it is. Instead of investing in it as a problem to solve, simply looking at it as a condition. Like if a gust of wind were to come by and you noticed that it was cold, you certainly wouldn't take any responsibility for the wind or the cold. You would just notice it. You might be discomforted by it. You might even resist it a little bit and hug yourself or put on a sweater or something. So maybe there's something you could do non-compulsively to soften that guilt by expressing some compassion towards yourself. Yeah, this is sort of typical of how I think. It's very uncomfortable. I'm sure lots of people are feeling guilty right now if they're not suffering while other people are suffering. You know what? I'm doing a pretty good job of navigating this as best I can. I don't have to be perfect. Let's see, what would be a good use of my attention right now? Oh yeah, I haven't finished the finale of Schitt's Creek. I should go do that, right? And then directing yourself towards something that might actually be good and both comforting and nourishing, which you would do for anybody that you cared about even a little bit, right?
Yeah. Cool. No, thank you for that. That's helpful. So, as you said, with this particular theme, and I guess any OCD theme right now, many, I'm not going to say any, a lot of them are probably extra heightened for some people. Some people are doing fantastically, I should add, as you mentioned earlier. But some people may be triggered, especially with contamination or harm or moral scrupulosity right now. So in a way, we can still do the exposures and lean in extra, but they're probably being triggered just naturally without having to do the exposures. So Just any kind of words of wisdom around reducing compulsions or stopping compulsions at this time, say with regards to this theme.
Well, the more overt compulsions to resist would be things like Googling or sort of philosophical mining through the internet, looking for some gem that's going to let you off the hook. And you have to remember, the more you invest in the investigation of your morality, the more you're sending the signal to your brain that there's an open case as opposed to a cold case. Right? So a cold case is a crime that has not been solved, that sits in a box somewhere on a shelf, right? And if you're doing these mental rituals and you're doing this reassurance seeking, you're repeatedly taking that box off the shelf, opening it up and digging through it. And you're sending that signal like, no, this is an active case and we're going to solve it. If we want freedom from that, we have to let it be a cold case. We have to notice when we have that urge to figure it out and say, yep, there's a mystery there, right? There's that uncertainty. Yep, it's uncomfortable. Okay, what's the best use of my attention right now? Is it to take that box off the shelf, open it, and go through it again? Or is it to point myself in the direction of something that really matters to me, that's in front of me, that's real? So obviously eliminating as much reassurance seeking as you can, both online and in person, educating the people that you're with who care about you, who hate to see you suffer, that when you're asking them moral questions, it's probably your OCD, and they can help you by saying, I'm not going to help you with the moral stuff because I think that's your OCD. I think maybe we should talk about something else. I mean, it's kind of funny how we assign honorary degrees to our loved ones. You know, suddenly your wife has become a moral philosopher and has 3 PhDs in morality. And that's why it's okay for her to answer the question of whether or not it's okay to move on, but it's not okay for you to answer it for yourself. We make people the arbiters of truth when we ask them for a lot of reassurance. So getting them to help us resist the reassurance is a good thing to do. The hardest thing about moral scrupulosity, of course, is that it's primarily characterized by mental rituals. It's primarily characterized by mental review, the trying to figure it out and not understanding that that's what you're doing, right? You think you're problem solving, but in fact, you're just doing a compulsion. You're washing your mind's hands of something that might be on there, but you're not sure. And if you can recognize that you're doing that, and you can recognize that urge to, oh, my mind feels a bit contaminated and I want to clean it by thinking hard about it, by ruminating. So, oh, wait, that's the compulsion I'm trying to resist. Good catch. Let me come back to the present and focus my attention on something of greater value. People who get better from OCD, the process they go through is the thing of greater value becomes less and less and less significant, so that at some point, everything is of greater value than your OCD mind games. A lot of people will stop doing compulsions to get to work on time. They'll say, well, I have to get to work on time. And they won't think of it as a choice. They'll think of it as well, there's no way I couldn't. I just can't show up for work late because I was washing my hands or because I was trying to finish a mental ritual. But in fact, there are people more severe than that who will show up for work late or not show up for work at all. And they often need higher levels of care. And if you understand that that's a choice, then how does that get scaled down? Okay, I don't have time for this ritual because I need to help prepare dinner for my family. Okay, that seems pretty important. And then how does that get scaled down? Oh, I don't have time for this ritual because I'm kind of in the middle of watching my show right now, and I don't want to be bothered with this philosophical nonsense. I want to know what's going to happen in the show. And then all the way down to the bottom, when you get to something close to mastery, it's, I don't have time for this because the feeling of the weight of my body in this chair is more interesting than that project. Or the breath is more important because that's real and I can see it. And this is theoretical and I can't. So the other note that I would give to people who want to continue doing exposure for their moral scrupulosity is you want to put yourself in situations, and this is not just about COVID, and some of this stuff has become harder to do because we're not leaving the house, but you want to try to put yourself in situations where you're likely to be triggered so you can practice not responding to those triggers with compulsions. So for some people, that might look like scrolling through your social media news feed and noticing when people say things that are triggering, and then not clicking through to follow up on it, not clicking through to that article, or sending them a signal, that, or sometimes people will say things that are scary. I'm so mad at my boss, I'm going to kill him, or something like that. And then you might feel like, oh no, if I don't stop this person, it's my responsibility. So that could be a trigger for you. Scripting can sometimes play a role, doing imaginal exposures. So you would write about how perhaps you did do something immoral and perhaps you'll have to live with that. You just have to be very careful, I think, with moral scrupulosity scripts, not to let them devolve into compulsive self-punishment, because it's a very fine line. Because you could end up writing a script that basically says, I'm a piece of garbage, I deserve to die, I'm never going to get better. And all you're really getting from that is depression and more rumination.
Yeah.
It has to be a confrontation with uncertainty and a repeated challenge to embrace that uncertainty for it to work.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. That's useful. Well, one of the things that you've talked about before along the lines of scripting was an acceptance script, which I think you talked about in the mindfulness workbook. I could be wrong there. Could that be useful in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be useful in any case. And an acceptance and motivation script is basically a strategy for pointing yourself in a useful therapeutic direction. So the way I do these, and different therapists might have different strategies for doing these. It's not like some patented protocol or anything like that. But I try to break it down into 4 basic ideas. One is a reflection on what you're going to change. So in the case of moral scrupulosity, it's, I'm going to really try to recognize when I'm ruminating and drop that rumination for the present moment. And I'm going to stop seeking reassurance about this event or this, whether I'm having the right emotion or whatever the target fear is. And I'm going to start doing things that, that maybe you had been prohibiting yourself from doing because it was morally triggering. And so basically that's a way of saying, here are the compulsions I'm planning to stop, or here are the exposures I'm planning to do. Yeah. And then the next part is taking ownership of why this is hard. And it's hard because there is uncertainty. And so the question is, what unwanted consequence might occur as a result of me making these changes? So you would write a little paragraph saying, this might mean that I have failed to act in a morally responsible way, or it might mean that I discover that I made a moral misstep for which I cannot atone, or it may mean that I do the wrong thing and that people that I care about get hurt as a result, and that I have to figure out a way to live with that. And then the next step is, what's the likely outcome of obeying the OCD here, or of choosing not to make these changes? So then you just write a little thing basically saying, painting a very scary picture of life with OCD's volume turned all the way up. So if I don't make these changes, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in my head. I'm going to remain completely confused about my values. I'm going to become avoidant of my family. I'm going to be chronically depressed because I'm going to always think I'm a bad person with no wiggle room. And the outcome of this, you try to map out an outcome of this that's realistic but really unpleasant, and it usually involves a lot of, maybe I'll have to go to a hospital, or maybe I'll have to be on all these medications, or maybe I'll have to, avoid my family members because it's just so intense to be around them that I have to completely isolate and live alone. Which, if you're paying attention, that outcome is often as bad, if not worse, than the outcome that your OCD is always going on about. Right? Yeah. And then the fourth one is, some might say it's a very kind of ACT approach, which is just, well, what are the things that I value that make it worth it for me to take this risk? So John Grayson writes his scripts with this idea in mind a lot, if you've read his book, of, why is it worth it for me to take the risk of fighting my OCD? And then in ACT, you might think about, what are the values that I'm trying to go towards, and how do my compulsions take me away from them? And so I've kind of combined both of these ideas into this very simple question of, what am I that makes it worth it for me to make these changes? What kind of a husband am I? What kind of a father am I? What kind of a son am I? What kind of a professional am I? What kind of a student am I? And basically lay out, I want to make this contribution to the world. And I know that I can't do that if the answer to question number 3 comes true.
Yeah.
And although it's not a guarantee, because question number 2 still scares the daylights out of me, it's worth it. I'm going to give it a shot. And that's the motivation part of it. So you're pointing yourself in the direction of, I'm here to accept uncertainty and to stop doing compulsions. And I want to do this because it's actually what I really believe. It's actually what I really want.
Yeah. No, I like that. And thank you for breaking it down. So, words of hope for people with moral scrupulosity.
Well, I don't know that they would be any different than words for hope for people with any kind of OCD. An important thing to understand about OCD is that we talk about subtypes only in the context of that being helpful for us finding the best exposures. And sometimes it can be helpful to talk in subtypes for communication purposes. So if I have moral scrupulosity and you have moral scrupulosity, we could be like morally scrupulous buddies, which is nice. And maybe I won't relate to quite as much if you have hyper awareness or contamination and I don't. So it's okay to have these subtypes for that purpose as well. But at the end of the day, it's not about the content. It's about the process. It's not about the words or the sentences that the words make up that are the thoughts in your head. It's about whether or not you're choosing a behavior in response to those words and sentences in your head that makes sense, that points you in the direction of a life of the most possible suffering or something less than that. And we should be aiming for something less than that. So hope is out there in the sense that OCD is a treatable disorder. We have exposure and response prevention. We have CBT. We have mindfulness. These are tools that you can learn. And the problem that you're having right now that's causing you so much suffering is that you've conditioned your brain and you've conditioned your mind to repeatedly respond in the same way. And you can learn to condition yourself in a different direction and practice that and then see the results for yourself. And that's the beauty of the work that we do, is that we don't have to make stuff up or say, gee, I hope this works. I mean, it's kind of a neat idea. You can actually see it happen for yourself. The patient, the client can tell me, the therapist, I think it's working, and the evidence that it's working is this. Right? Yeah. So hopefully that's the hope that you're looking for.
Nice. No, I appreciate it. Thank you. And you've got a billboard. What do you want written on that billboard?
Well, right now, with everything going on, if you can see my billboard, go home. I think it's the best, is all I can say about that. I think the last time we spoke, the billboard I settled on was, you're going to be okay. And that one holds true. And when this pandemic is over, we can put that one back up.
Cool. Absolutely. And lastly, is there anything else that you wish you could have shared today?
No, I actually I liked the flow of this conversation. Sometimes I get nervous in these conversations, and my mind strays, and I forget why I'm here and who you are and what this is all about. And I think we actually covered a lot. Of course, we missed things because it would be impossible not to. And right now, there's some morally scrupulous person out there who's probably really mad at me because I didn't mention something that's probably really key and really important. And so I apologize. And I'm also going to move on from that now. I'm going to sit with that uncertainty myself.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on to this extra bonus episode, whatever we want to call it, for COVID and moral scrupulosity.
Be good to yourselves.
So there you have it. Thank you to Jon for his time and to you guys for listening. And all links will be at theocdstories.com, including the link to the first COVID-19 episode I did with Dr. John Grayson. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It's not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. Until we speak, take care.